Good afternoon, good evening, gentlemen. Orsmer is proud to present very, very special guest, Professor Chaim Sukenik, who's going to be speaking to us about the interplay between science and Torah, the challenges and opportunities. So, Professor Sukenik has been involved in the scientific research, academic teaching, and administration as a graduate student of Caltech, a postdoctorate at UCLA, a professor of chemistry and material science at Case Western University, as a professor of chemistry of nanoscience at Bar-Ilan University, and now is the president of the Jerusalem College of Technology. Professor Sukenik will share his perspective on how science and Torah can enrich each other, and how the study of Torah and science can bring out the best in each and every one of us. Professor Sukenik.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I see a familiar face. All good. Wonderful. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And it really is an opportunity because for me, the interaction between Torah and science, technology, is something that I've lived with for a very long time. I've thought about a lot. And I know that there are many ways that people approach it. I'd like to share with you my approach, but the condition is, A, that you feel comfortable asking questions, because if I say something that's clear to me but not clear to you, then I really haven't accomplished anything. And more importantly, I would love for this to be a dialogue. I think it's really important. I do not intend to probe deeply into all of the topics that I'd like to touch on, but I think if there is something that particularly interests one or more of you, I'm happy to pursue it a bit. If it seems to me that we're going too far afield, then I'll say, okay, we'll pick it up afterwards. Okay, so that's the deal between us. I'd like to divide my perspective of this interaction between Torah and science into three separate domains. Okay, there is a domain where people have classically talked about resolving conflicts between a traditional Jewish approach and modern science. I will tell you that domain, frankly, is the one that least interests me. It's one that I think is really a carryover from the church. That is, there was a time when wisdom was ostensibly the domain of the church. And therefore, if you came along as a person doing science and challenged the prevailing wisdom of the church, you were a heretic and you could be burnt at the stake or whatever the appropriate fate was. And I think that that's carried over a bit. And interestingly enough, if you look at where it came from, I think it actually came from two places. Number one, the church felt a real need to assert its authority, because that's where its power came from. But more importantly, there was a tendency to try to really stick to the literal interpretation of the text. Chazal didn't feel compelled to do that. And in fact, easily in the time of Rishonim and certainly after, the Rambam, the Abarbanel, Rashi, the Ramban, almost all of them make it very clear that they did not read Sefer Bereshis literally. They are not troubled by age of the earth things. Now, admittedly, we're going back 1,000 years. Okay, so what they might have been troubled by is very different than what we're looking at today. But there seems to be no difficulty whatsoever. And if anything, it's hafuch. If anything, there are fairly clear allusions that I suspect you've talked about because they're widely available, and I know many Rabbanim use them as topics for discussion, where some of the things that were said, for example, by the Ramban, seem to speak to things like the Big Bang. They seem to be much more readily understandable when the Ramban talks about matter being created from a single spot, from something very, very concentrated, very dense, high energy. That sounds kind of like what ultimately developed after the radio telescopes and other things pointed us towards what we today talk about as an origin of the universe from a Big Bang. So not only is there not a contradiction, but if anything, if you look at what the prevailing scientific approach was, going back more than 200 years ago, anything more than 200 years ago, there was this very strange conflict where Yadus was very comfortable with the idea of a single point of creation, of yesh me'ayin, of a starting point, and yet the prevailing scientific world really felt there was this kind of steady state. And things had always been, ma shehayahu, ma she'yeh, what was is what will be. So if anything, when they came along with the idea of a bang and an expanding universe, that actually was far less of a conflict with prevailing Jewish thought. And I think it's important to put that in perspective. As I said, I think you can find many sources that will talk both about the age of the earth. Maybe we should just comment briefly on evolution, because those two seem to be the biggies that people point to. And again, Rashi and other Rishonim talk about the words in Maisa Bereshis, that we talk about Bereshis bara Elokim, the Bria, the creation was an initial event, but then other things which are referred to with words that talk about doing, like Yetzira and Asiya, those are words that are not yesh me'ayin. So the possibility that there is an evolutionary pattern is well within the realm of what Chazal would have been comfortable with, I think. Admittedly, there are some who prefer a much more strict constructionist approach to the text, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to keep me up at night, because as I say, there are so many different approaches to it. Approach to the age of the earth as saying, well, geology and radio astronomy and all of that stuff is simply wrong. That you're not going to hear hardly from anyone today. And in fact, as chemistry and physics, a little bit less so biology, but as chemistry and physics have become mature sciences, the possibility that they will be uprooted and that their foundations will have to be constructed anew has become vanishingly small. Okay, even things like quantum mechanics that came along, it didn't supplant Newtonian mechanics. It simply said there is a domain where there's a different kind of mechanics that operates, that controls the behavior of material. But the idea that science can be disproven and therefore we don't have to pay attention to it is, I believe, not such a prevalent approach today. It's certainly one that I'm not terribly comfortable with. The idea that all of this is part of what Chazal wanted us to understand and approach God's world in that way is very clear. Again, going back to Rishonim, famous Rambam that everyone quotes, in terms of how does one come to Avas Hashem? How do you come to loving God? You come to loving God by getting to know His creation. And in fact, the more interesting shaila that comes up there is, if knowing God's creation is a way towards Avas Hashem, does that mean you should make Birkas HaTorah before you open your physics textbook? And there is such an approach. I suspect that it's one that we won't get into, and I certainly don't pretend to paskin anything today. But I think that the idea that a familiarity with God's world is something that can lead to not only a better understanding, but a deeper sense of connection to God, to the divine operation, is something that I think is very much a theme of at least the world that I grew up in as an observant Jew. In fact, I will tell you, when I was a new graduate student at Caltech, the first year that I was there, there was a gentleman by the name of Max Delbruck, who was a very respected physicist who had become a biologist. He sort of leaned over into biology and then, of course, got a Nobel Prize for his work in biology. And Professor Delbruck was already well into his 80s, still riding his bicycle to campus in Pasadena every day. And he decided that first semester that I was there to teach a course that he called Biophysics for the Non-Biologist. In other words, all of us people, I was coming from a chemistry background, there were many physics people there, all of us people, he was going to educate us in state-of-the-art biology. We're talking back in the mid-1970s. But do it in a way where he understood the perspective of the physical scientist. And one lecture that I recall, he was explaining how chromosomes separate, come back together, cells, how they divide, how they replicate. And he says, and it's amazing that there are some diseases this was sort of relatively novel at that point, that they had identified already as problems with the way the machinery in the cell operated. If things didn't quite replicate 100%, that could lead to certain mutations, to certain problems that evolved as diseases. And one of the physics postdocs in the audience stands up and says, Professor Delbruck, why does it go wrong? How could that be that nature makes mistakes? And he says, that's not the question. The question is, how does it not go wrong 99.999% of the time? There's something amazing working here. There's something absolutely fantastic. So don't get caught up on those little things that don't work. That's part of the system. And in fact, error correction, it's fascinating, and it's actually part of my own way of approaching certain topics in Chumash. Error correction is very much a part of successful scientific development. And in fact, if you ask an engineer, what will guarantee a robust system? It's a system that is able to correct errors. We always make assumptions that we're going to make mistakes, and our ability to survive and to move on is not linked to never making mistakes. It's linked to correcting mistakes. And without going too far into it now, but if you take a look when Klal Yisrael was supposed to go into Eretz Yisrael the first time around, Baaloscha, and ultimately towards the end of Dvarim, when they do go in, there are a number of halachos there that seem to be out of place, but they are in many cases error corrections. So whether it's Pesach Sheni, whether it's Ir Miklat, there are a number of things that make sense once you recognize that when Klal Yisrael left the desert, they were leaving this divinely orchestrated life. And now all of a sudden, b'derech hateva, when they're operating within the world of nature, what's the one thing they need most? They need a way to fix mistakes, because mistakes will happen. So I think that's a large piece of my understanding of how those texts are meant to be treated. But I think beyond just the Avas Hashem aspect, there are insights into Torah that one can get from scientific training. Okay, and I'll give you some examples. But my starting point is actually an essay that I read from Rav Nebenzahl years ago. Rav Nebenzahl, in his Sefer on Divrei Torah, on Parsha Shavua, around Shavuos time, talks about why was it so important for the Torah to emphasize that all of Klal Yisrael stood by Har Sinai, that we were all there together, and that the receiving of the Torah was a national act of receiving the Torah. It wasn't that any one individual or group of individuals, but it was done as the totality of Klal Yisrael receiving the Torah. So Rav Nebenzahl says it there from the perspective of mitzvos. And he says, look, he says, some of us really like a particular mitzvah. When I was young, I used to really get a kick out of picking arba minim. My vision today is probably not as good as it was then, so I don't get into it as much, and I let my son do it. But the idea that you can have a favorite mitzvah, and that will be the mitzvah that you connect with. Your mitzvah may be Hachnasas Orchim, and your mitzvah may be Shmiras Shabbos, and your mitzvah may be Limud Torah, but it is the totality of our collective Shmiras HaMitzvos that really gives substance to the Kiyum of Torah. When we say that Torah is fulfilled by Am Yisrael, each of us to the extent that we can do it, but we're each contributing our unique part to that entire corpus that we call Shmiras HaMitzvos. I would argue that Rav Nebenzahl's idea applies even more so when it comes to Limud Torah. Because let's face it, the Torah is very much a function of how you process it, how it comes through your eyes. Okay, the idea of a Masorah, the idea of a tradition that you get from your Rebbe. It doesn't mean that your Rebbe is right and somebody else's Rebbe is wrong, but there is a personalization of Torah which is essential to the understanding of Torah. And I think Rav Nebenzahl's concept is saying the same way each of us will have our own Kiyum HaMitzvos, and we'll have our own way of fulfilling some piece of the Torah, and it is only by adding them all up that we will get to the totality of Shmiras HaMitzvos. So too when Chazal say Shivim Panim LaTorah. What does that mean, Shivim Panim LaTorah? Come on guys, you gotta wake up, man. I know it's late, but what's Shivim Panim LaTorah? What does that mean? 70 Panim? Faces. What does it mean 70 faces? Torah doesn't have any faces as far as I know. Interpretations. Or there are 70 perspectives, 70 approaches, because your face is typically what you use with which to approach something. So there are 70 different approaches to Torah, all of which can be valid, and some of which will be particularly relevant to one generation, far less relevant to another generation. Okay? That Shivim Panim La Torah, I believe, part of the fulfillment of the Shivim Panim La Torah is that when you and I look at a pasuk, we will each see different things in that pasuk. You will see things that will reflect your perspective and your background. I will see things that reflect my background, and I'll give you two examples. My background, my professional background, is that of a chemist. So for a long time, I worry about materials. I worry about the characteristics of different materials, big, small, what can they do, what can't they do. That's the professional world that I come from. There is a very interesting observation that I think is made by a number of Rishonim, but I would like to put these observations into my own chemist's perspective. Nachash hanachoshes, the copper serpent, the copper snake, where was that? What's the story behind that?
The plague.
When they were in the desert, right? Something went wrong. We won't worry about what it was.
Hashem said like these snakes.
Right? And the way they were punished was that snakes came and bit the people and they died.
Moshe Rabbeinu prayed.
Well, he didn't just pray. Moshe Rabbeinu was given the antidote by direct divine communication. What did God tell him to do?
Make a copper snake.
Okay. Aselecha saraf. God uses a slightly different word. It's not quite nachash. Right? Va'aleo al nes, and put it up on a stick, on a pole, something that will draw everybody's attention. Okay? And by people looking at that, that will somehow enable them to be healed, right? And Chazal tell us, it's already from the Mishnah and Gemara, that what we're looking at really is not the ability to see a statue, but rather the inspiration that one derived, much the same as Moshe's hands in the battle with Amalek. There was an inspiration that came to the people. There was a recognition that when people looked at this Nachash HaNechoshes that was held up on the nace, on that pole, they understood that what they were being subjected to, even though the embodiment was snakes biting them and killing them, but it was really something going on high. And they were being reminded of that, and hopefully, by being reminded of it, they would then turn and do tshuva and sort of get their act together. Okay? So the Mefarshim there say, well, wait a minute. Usually when you're doing exalted things in terms of avoda, in terms of the worship service in the desert, you're doing them with very high-class materials, like gold. Right? The kalim in the Beis Hamikdash were generally made out of gold. There are a few that are made out of silver, and there are explanations, in fact, for some of the specifics there. But what was this nachash made out of? Out of nechoshes. What's nechoshes? Copper. Okay, so the hierarchy, and it's for those of you that are following the Olympics, I think. So there's a gold and a silver, and there's a bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper, but sounds a little bit better than copper for some reason. In any event, so Moshe was told, make a nachash, make a snake, and make it out of nechoshes. Why did he make it out of nechoshes? So there are a number of opinions by different Rishonim, okay? One sort of theme is that because nechoshes has this sort of bright, fiery red appearance, especially when held up in the sun, it would draw attention. It would be easy to see it from far away. Okay, that's one. On the other hand, there are those who talk about the play on words. There's nachash, nechoshes, they kind of sound the same, and maybe that's why he did it, though it's a little bit hard to believe that God was just playing word games with Moshe. So I will tell you that the first time I saw it as a chemist, I said, wait a minute. If you would have made this nachash out of gold, gold is about 4 times as dense as copper. A nachash that is big enough to be seen by 3 to 4 million people, it's got to be pretty big. If you make it out of gold, it's really hard to pick it up. If you make it out of copper, it already becomes less than a third of the weight. It's a more manageable kind of task. So at that level, I'm not saying that that's giving you blinding insight, but what I'm saying is that there are things that as a person with experience in materials, I would see that someone else who is no less knowledgeable in Torah might not see it. And I think that's part of our obligation. One other, which is a little bit more subtle, we're now reading about the Kalim in the Mishkan, okay? And when Klal Yisrael traveled, what they had to do was to take those Kalim and wrap them up. So there were covers that were put on them. You'll find them at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. And the covers that were put, there's some that were animal skins, but each of the Kalim was also covered by a cloth, by a dyed cloth. Okay, the observation, again, I'm just reading the psukim. The observation is that all of the Kalim are covered by a cloth that is dyed with tchelis. Okay, the blue dye that some of you may be wearing in your tzitzis, but that's what all, except for one. There's one kli, there is one utensil of the Mishkan that is not dyed with tchelis, it's dyed with argaman. Okay, now for those of you that have looked a little bit into the contemporary discussion around tchelis as it is embodied today, tchelis and argaman are related. A word of chemistry, not too much. The difference between tchelis and argaman is that argaman has these benzene rings in them, but those benzene rings have bromine atoms on them. And when you convert the argaman to the tcheles, there's a chemical process that chops off those bromine atoms. The practical impact is that argaman is more purplish and tcheles is more blue. That's the bottom line in terms of what we see. But what's interesting is that today's fire retardant polymers, which are used for everything from babies' pajamas to blankets for all kinds of equipment to make sure that they don't catch fire, all of the polymers that are used have bromine atoms on them. There's something about bromine that is able to stop fire, that when the bromine atoms get chopped off, they sort of soak up stuff that would otherwise just keep on burning. Well, the one kli that is covered by argaman is the Mizbach HaNechoshes. It's the Mizbeach on which the offerings were brought, primary offerings were brought as they traveled in the desert. Okay? There is a mitzvah which is debated among the Rishonim, which says that you're not supposed to extinguish the fire that is on that Mizbeach. There's a debate among the Rishonim as to whether the extinguishing of the fire only applies while the Mizbeach is sitting on the ground, or even during transport was it not supposed to be extinguished. But either way, that Mizbach HaNechoshes was pretty hot. Okay, and what was it covered with? It was covered with what they called a pachtar, with a hollow sort of cover, I don't know any other word for it, okay, which I suspect got pretty warm also, whether or not the flame was burning or not burning. So you have a machlokas rishonim as to whether the flame is burning, but you clearly have this mizbeach that is being covered by a flame retardant polymer, woven material, whereas the others are not. Now, is that the only perspective on why this one is argaman and the others are tchela? No, the Netziv says because argaman is a more royal color. Tcheles is nice, it reminds you of the ocean, it reminds you of the sky, but it's not royalty. The Mizbeach, which is at the lead of all of the avoda, of all of the service in the Mishkan, that's the royalty. That's the one that goes at the head. And therefore the Netziv says it was appropriate that that's the one that should be covered with a piece of cloth that was reflective of royalty. Is there an argument between what the Netziv is saying and what I'm saying? No. These are different perspectives of the same phenomenon. We're not arguing about the what. We're simply saying that within the why, within the understanding of how the Torah gave us this mitzvah of covering the kalim, it may very well be that there was a perspective that wanted to accentuate the royalty of the Mizbach HaNechoshes, but there was another perspective that was more practical and said, listen, if this is a hot surface, if I'm going to put something on it that's going to catch fire, it's not going to look very good, and therefore we will use something that's more flame retardant. But it's a perspective that would probably only occur to a person coming from the material science chemistry background. So I say this also as a plea to you. When you learn Torah, that Torah has to go through you. It has to become part of you. And part of making that Torah part of you, don't run away from what you knew from before. The opposite. If you have a background in psychology, it's okay to look at the events in the Torah through the eyes of a psychologist. Now, you're going to have to temper it with an understanding of who the personalities were, what was the circumstance, but that's what any good psychologist would do today anyway. Okay? So the idea that we want to have our Shivim Panim LaTorah reflect multiple layers of meaning that HaKadosh Baruch Hu built into the text is also Shivim Panim LaTorah, that it is our obligation to uncover multiple layers of meaning, because as each of us brings his own perspective, we will uncover something, you will uncover something that I would have never seen. And I think that's really important because that's part of our responsibility. And going back to Rav Nevensal's, the Torah, the limud of Torah has to be complete. We've got to get all of it in. Well, guess what? If you're not going to learn your part of Torah, nobody else is going to do it for you. And that piece of Torah, those insights into Torah that could have emerged from your personal perspective may be lost. So I think the responsibility that each of us has to actually process the Torah, to bring our own chidushim in Torah, to bring our own perspective to Torah, is part of what, at least for me, my scientific training has sensitized me to it and has made that very much a part of the way I read a pasuk or I read a Mishnah. That's just the way it is. But there's a third domain. And the third domain is really, let's ask the question. We are Anshei Halacha. We are people who want to conduct our lives based on the dictates of Halacha. Halacha both in the written law, in Torah Shebiksav, and as it has been further defined over the generations in Torah Shebal Peh. How does Halacha deal with changes that are not so much science but technology? In other words, there's a certain amount of awareness, there's a certain amount of understanding that we get simply by progress of scientific tools, okay? Halacha has to deal with that. And then there are the challenges that are presented to us by new technologies where we have to figure out how to frame them within a halachic context. When it comes to understanding how science would deal with physical observations, I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine, for the years that I was at Bar Ilan, a gentleman by the name of Dror Fixler. Dror is a physicist who specializes in photonics and in sort of manipulating light by using fancy devices. Dror, though, is also an Ish Torah. And he published, a few years ago, a study where he tried to address the phenomena of blia b'kelim, of absorbing material into vessels. Okay, and just two words, and again, I'm happy to elaborate on these things, but I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. When I tell you, oops, don't use that dairy pot to cook my meat soup, even if the pot was clean, there's an assumption that some of the dairiness was absorbed into the walls of the pot. And if I now put a meat soup into that pot and cook it, some of that dairiness will be desorbed into the soup and could cause problems in terms of the separation of milk and meat. Okay, so blia is the absorbing process. Plita is the process of spitting something out, of getting it away from where it had been absorbed. When Chazal looked at the rules about blia and plita, they said, listen, we have rules in the Torah that tell us that metal vessels, in order to kasher them when they won them in the Battle of Moab. So there was a requirement when you took the kalim that you recovered from a non-Jewish source, you had to take them to the mikveh, which has nothing to do with kashrus, but is the status as a non-Jew owned vessel versus a vessel owned by a Jew. But then there were kashrus issues, and we're told that the kashrus issues had to be addressed by putting something in the fire. Well, kibol-o, as the conditions were for this vessel to absorb material, so too are the conditions for it to spit out material. Okay? Well, Chazal didn't have tools necessarily for quantifying or even for verifying that. And there are a few indications back at the level of Rishonim and further back that they viewed this thing almost on a mystical basis. Because when you look at a pot or a piece of glass or whatever, it's a little hard to think about belia, about things being absorbed. Moreover, Chazal did recognize that different materials absorb to different degrees. Okay, so it's clear that unglazed pottery absorbs material from its surroundings much better than pottery that has this nice glassy glaze on it. And in fact, glass as a material is a very interesting material halachically in terms of does it absorb at all. Without getting into that, it's clear that mainstream halacha looks at glass as absorbing less than metal. Let's take that one statement as a statement that we don't have to get into subtleties of halachic opinions and traditions. Okay? So along comes Dror Fixler, and Dror says, okay, I get it. When you have wrought iron, it's going to absorb the roughness of the surface, and it's going to be a fairly porous material, and that can be demonstrated. But what about if I take stainless steel? Alloys like stainless steel were not known in way back when. Okay? And we know that alloys are such that when you add just a little bit of something extra, in the case of stainless steel, they're adding just a little bit of carbon. We know that you can affect the brittleness, the rust resistance, the bendability of metals and their alloys with very small tweaks of the composition. Okay? So Dror asked the question, he says, can we quantify absorption and desorption? And on that basis, can we do a quantitative comparison between metal and glass? Right? Glass is your halachic standard, if you will, for a non-absorbing material. Metal is a material that does absorb. Okay, at least that's the way we treat it. Okay, well, can we put some numbers on it? Can we validate it? Can we prove it? Okay, now, what came out of Dror's experiments, which were fascinating because there are ways using really simple chemical markers where you can not just verify the phenomena, but you can actually quantify it. In the time of the Rishonim, they couldn't quantify it, but there are records of somebody actually doing an experiment. One of the Rishonim did an experiment where he took a piece of pottery, of unglazed pottery, that had been exposed to meat and to things that had fatty juices in it, okay, cooked it, and then set it aside and cleaned it really, really well. And when he took the piece of pottery before it had been exposed to the meat with the fatty juices, and then he put it back in the fire, there was no real glow. When he took the one that had been used for cooking the meat back into the fire, it was inflamed. So he took that already then. I'm going back many hundreds of years. I'm going back almost 1,000 years. He took that already as an indication that this absorption is not a mystical thing, it's a physical thing. Okay, so within that, now let's quantify it. Let's use today's tools to quantify it. And what Dror found is that there is a profound difference between wrought iron and stainless steel. But when you looked at the amount of absorption and desorption into stainless steel, it was less than what you get into glass. Okay, now that's a little bit problematic, and we have to talk about how to relate to that problem. If halacha relates to glass as the archetypical non-absorbent material, and along comes this guy who does his experiment, and he says, I'll prove to you that there are some metals, alloys of iron, that will absorb even less than glass. And what's been fascinating to me is to watch the reactions of the community of Shomrei Torah mitzvos, okay? The experiments are really hard to challenge in terms of their validity. They've been scrutinized, they've been repeated by other people. It really works, okay? So now what do we do with it? So there is a school of thought among poskim here in Eretz Yisrael that say, you know what? We believe the experiment. And the experiment's probably right, but we've got two problems. One problem is, yes, that's true for absorption and desorption, but how do I make sure that every balabusta is going to wash her pots well enough that there's no surface stuff left between the tines of the fork? And it's a very practical but very real issue. So even if there was no blia, if there was no absorption, you'd still have to be really, really careful about using the same utensils for milchiks, for meat and for dairy. No less important, remember I said that alloys, their properties change even with small adjustments to the composition. So that means every time a new alloy is going to come out, I've got to now repeat Fixler's experiments. And I've now got to quantify once again and decide, is it enough that there will be taste imparted to the food? Not enough. So many, and I think probably the majority of poskim say, listen, when the Torah said metal, full well knowing that there are different kinds of metal, we're going to treat metal as a category. It's a kind of low plug. It's a kind of, let's not make the distinction because it's going to take us into the weeds in a way that we're never going to get out of it. And that to me is a perfectly reasonable way to relate to the scientific outcome. The data says this particular alloy of stainless steel does not absorb very much, but there are metals that do. And therefore, in order to guarantee the integrity of the system, I will relate to all metals one way, I will relate to glass another way, I will relate to pottery another way. But at the end of the day, it's simply, halacha tends to be a very practical system. We've got to be able to live with it. Yeah?
So then why do we not change the idea for glass, where we say, no, now, since there are metals that do beat glass, why don't we say glass also should be?
Because glasses as a category of materials, as this solid, solidified, disordered liquid, in general are very non-absorptive. Metals, many of them, especially the ones that are not this stainless steel kind of stuff, are much more absorptive. So when you're making the comment, you're now saying, look, operationally, a piece of glass is a piece of glass is a piece of glass. Don't worry about the details. They're all pretty much non-absorbent. And then there are different poskim that will relate to them for using for hot, for using for cold, but they will treat glass as a category. One of the big challenges that came up, I guess it must be 60, 70 years ago, was how do you relate to Corningware? On one hand, Corningware is a ceramic material. It was oven-proof. It was able to stand up to very, very high temperatures. The question of does it absorb, does it not absorb? Well, anybody who has old Corningware knows that it absorbs because it gets stained. But how one should treat it halachically in terms of koshering it and in terms of using it back and forth was an important issue that had to be dealt with, okay? In general, Corningware is not treated as glass, even though it's a ceramic, because it was used under such high temperature conditions. But again, I'm not coming to paskin Corningware or glass or metal. What I'm saying is that the response of the ish halacha, the response of the person who is honest with himself, when he sees a piece of science, as a scientist, you are taught to be skeptical. You are taught to question. You say, well, is that data really right? Let's reproduce it. Let's see if it is consistent with the rest of the literature. That's what you have to do. To maintain your integrity as a scientist, and I believe as a Ben Torah, you have to look for consistency and honesty. But once you've done that, so that you can no longer say, well, that's just nonsense, I don't want to hear it. Now you have to figure out what to do with it operationally. And I think that's perfectly fine. And I think that in general, that's exactly what happens. And therefore, the world of poskim is now coming to grips with how to treat this finding. They're not saying the finding is nonsense. They're simply saying, okay, let's now figure out how to integrate it into our daily life. And I think that's an important way to look at things. Now, remember, one of the things that this interface between science and halacha will do is that it will force us to sharpen some of our definitions. Okay? Example, we talk about hearing the Megillah, as will be coming up in Yirtzeh Hashem in another month. Okay, you have to hear the Megillah. Okay, if you hear the Megillah read over a microphone, was a shaila that was dealt with 50, 60 years ago. Can you hear the Megillah over a telephone where the sound is reproduced? Well, we've got a better one today. Today there is a device which enables people whose the inner parts of their ear have gone bad. They collect sound waves through a microphone that is magnetically coupled to a little package of electronics under their scalp. And that package of electronics is directly connected to the auditory nerve. So what this little piece of electronics does is it gets the signal much the same way as your ear would collect the signal, but instead of the collection device being a membrane that vibrates, it's now the membrane inside a microphone. Either of them translates the signal into an electrical impulse, which is then sent to the brain and gets translated. Now, you tell me, what's hearing? In the days of Chazal, hearing meant ears. Now, this has huge implications, right? Because as many of you may know, if a person is a cheresh, cannot hear, okay, there are certain halachic considerations as to whether he's obligated in certain mitzvos, whether he's able to help other people be yotzei those mitzvos. It's big stuff. It's important. So now, my question is, someone wearing a cochlear implant who hears with complete fidelity, okay, is that considered hearing? Is hearing something that happens at your ear, or is hearing something that happens at your brain? Okay, and all that I'm saying is that the scientist who looks at these questions is forced to sharpen definitions. I heard a talk last week. There's a fellow who does a shiur in Los Angeles Thursday nights, and fortunately, that's one of the blessings of Zoom. If I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning, I can watch the shiur as it's happening in Los Angeles at 8 in the evening there. And he was talking about a definition of death, okay? And before, say, 200 years ago, if someone stopped breathing, that was it. It was irreversible. If someone's heart stopped, it was essentially irreversible. Occasional outliers, but it was essentially irreversible. Okay, today, there are people walking around. The fellow who gave the scientific part of this lecture was the chief ethicist for Cedar Sinai Hospital, a huge hospital in Los Angeles. And he says they have patients walking around in the hospital who have neither a functioning heart nor functioning lungs. Okay, they have one of these ECMO machines that's been talked about in the context of COVID. After COVID, where the virus came in and just destroyed the lung tissue for many people, and their lungs were just never going to be functional again, but they were able to keep them alive with these ECMO machines, and they're waiting for a transplant. So he says, I've got people in the hospital now who are neither breathing, nor do they have a heartbeat of their own. Are they alive? It's a reasonable question. It's a question that was irrelevant to Chazal classically, but now that that technology exists, it's a question that we have to deal with. The urgency of that question, as I'm sure you all know, is that the definition of whether somebody is dead or not, when they're dead, it has to do with harvesting organs, it has to do with a lot of things. But even more than that, and I think it's critically important, let me pose the following question. The person whose heart stopped was dead. Along came this ability to do CPR with electric shock, with whatever. Now that person whose heart stopped, you would never consider dead. Well, sort of imagine a thought experiment of where the technology to get a guy back on track just came into existence now. So 5 minutes ago he was dead and now he's not dead? What does that mean? You have to sharpen your definition. You have to understand what does it really mean. And you don't have the choice of simply saying, well, we'll be machmir, we'll do the more stringent position, because there is no single stringent position here, especially when you're dealing with things like death because of organ transplants today. Okay? So I think that the scientific ear hears certain questions a little differently and can actually help in the halachic analysis. Now, there's another place where you have to be a little bit careful. When surrogate motherhood first came along, okay, the ability to do in vitro fertilization, IVF, a technique that has, Baruch Hashem, led to the birth of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of children in the world today, a super important achievement, okay? But in many cases, the IVF that is done outside the body, when it gets implanted back into the womb of a mother to carry the pregnancy, it's not the same woman who donated the biological material. Okay, so now, and this is not a new shaila, okay? I simply want to use it as a way of perhaps addressing, you might want to pick that up, I don't know what's on it. It looks holy. The idea that you have to sharpen your definition of what is a mother was a question that Chazal could not have asked. Now, I will tell you, one of the things that I learned when I came to Machon Lev, Zev Lev, the founder of the institution, was a physicist. But not just stam, he was an Israel Prize-winning physicist, like sort of just right below Nobel Prize level. But he was a Ben Torah who was a Ben Bayis by Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky here in Israel when Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach needed advice on questions on shilas that related to physics. Professor Lev was the go-to guy. So Zev Lev was clearly a shem davar. He was someone that to be reckoned with. I've been told, and I've seen at least one indication that it's probably a true story, that Professor Lev went, this goes back now 25 years, and went to the biggest poskim here in Eretz Yisrael, okay? We're talking about not just Rav Shlomo Zalman, but when it came subsequently to Rav Elyashiv, the people who have the weight of the halachic behavior of Am Yisrael on their shoulders, okay? And he sat, and he tried to make analogies to how should one think about surrogate motherhood. Is it a function of the biological material? Is it a function of the gestational carrier? He tried to make analogies from Harkova, from grafting one branch onto another stem. Well, do I consider the original trunk like the gestational mother and the branch that gets grafted onto it? Maybe that's the biological material. There were a variety of analogies that he presented to the poskim that he spoke to, and they shut them all down. None of them were good enough analogies. And that has led to a situation today where often, depending on the posek, but often IVF today is viewed l'chumra in both directions. That is, both the birth mother and the biological material mother are regarded as the mothers of that child, and therefore their other children are forbidden to marry the child that came out of the IVF, etc. Now, it's getting even more complicated because contemporary IVF is now done in many cases to guarantee better success by taking a little bit of mitochondrial DNA from woman number 3 and injecting it into the fertilized ovum. So I've now got 3 mothers. Okay? Not simple. But what I'm saying is that the perspective of the scientist is one that says, let's get our definition straight. And in some cases, we're going to have to simply say, we don't have adequate precedent to come up with clear-cut definitions, but we'll do the best that we can. And halacha knows how to deal with sfeikos and with other parameters. Yeah?
So in that case, does the donor and mother have to be Jewish also? Or? So
again, I'm reluctant. The entire world of gestational technology, okay, sperm donation, egg donation, surrogate mothers, it's a world unto itself, and it's a world that I'd prefer not to touch on because there are so many aspects to it. So I will refer it to your rabbanim and ask them to deal with it. I think it's tremendously important, but again, it's not something to be dealt with in a sort of offhand kind of way. What, by the way, and again, when you talk about definitions, sometimes the definition of when something is permitted versus when something is obligatory also comes into a halachic discussion. There's a technology that just became available fairly recently where they talk about genetic testing of a not implanted fertilized ovum. Okay? That is, I take 8 ova, I fertilize them in 8 separate test tubes, and now I'm the obstetrician who will choose one to implant in the mother that will carry the baby. Could be the same mother. I don't want to mix too many parameters in here. However, there is a technology available today that when that fertilized ova has grown to about 100 cells, okay, again, without going too much cell biology, there is cell differentiation, which happens in a somewhat later stage, but in the very early stages where the cells are simply replicating themselves, they're all the same. And that means that if I can make a teeny tiny incision in this blastula, in this little ball of fertilized ova, make a little incision and pull out 1 cell. There are 100 cells in there. I can pull out 1 through a teeny tiny pipette. I can do a full genetic profile of what that embryo person will look like. Okay, from 1 cell. Now, the obviously good side of that is that there are some genetic diseases that can be diagnosed at the level of a DNA map, and you can avoid cystic fibrosis, and you can avoid Tay-Sachs, and it's wonderful, okay? Will we get to a point where we will say to people, you know what? In order to avoid the ogmas nefesh, the pain of various problems, we're going to force all children to be born only after they've been tested from an IVF and doing this pre-implantation diagnostics. It's kind of a Brave New World concept, but what I'm saying is halacha has to be able, and is, able to not only decide when something is permitted, to decide when something is obligatory, and to decide when something is forbidden entirely, but it has to be done based on very clear definitions. And I'm going to give you one example, and then I think I'm going to close, because it's an example that's near and dear to my heart, because we have a unit at Machon Lev now, which is a Beis Medrash, it's a kollel, that specifically studies the issues of technology and halacha. What was the first topic that they chose to take on? And they've been working on it for about 2 years and have just published a 100-page position paper in some really dense halachic Hebrew, which is now being translated into English for all the rest of us. Cultured meat, okay? The technology for what is generically called tissue engineering is something that's been around for a little over 50 years, where people have known that you could take cells, put them into a tissue culture, and get them to grow, and they replicate themselves, okay? Well, the next step can go in one of two directions. Either I can encourage the cells to grow into a heart, because I don't have any really good replacement hearts available for a particular patient, okay? And that's one direction. That is, growing organs is a major branch of tissue engineering and biomedical engineering, okay? But the other question is food. People have made a big deal about the fact that cows are not a terribly efficient way to make steaks. They take years to grow. They consume a huge amount of natural resources. If I could just take a couple of stem cells from that cow and grow the steak from those stem cells and do it in a matter of a couple of days, that's a heck of a lot more efficient way of producing meat than the cow on the hoof. And think about it from a kashrus point of view. If I can do that, I don't have to worry about checking the shechted animal to make sure that it doesn't have any damage to the lungs or to the interior in any way. The entire operation changes, and now my meat production facility, instead of being a slaughterhouse, becomes a large bioreactor. Okay? Now, the questions there, if you look at the literature that was written about this about 30 years ago, the big questions that everybody was worried about was, is it parv? Because everybody wanted a cheeseburger. That was like the holy grail. You needed a cheeseburger. Well, today, not only can you make the cheeseburger out of parv meat, but you can also get milk that never saw the inside of a cow, because they can genetically engineer yeast to produce both of the key milk proteins, take the fat from the veggies and turn on the faucet for the water, and you got milk that was never in a cow. So don't worry about it. The cheeseburgers are out there, guys. But what's fascinating to me is that the range of halachic opinions that have emerged from this 2-year-long study literally run the gamut from some people who say stem cells, if you harvest them, the way they want to harvest them in industry, by the way, is to impregnate a cow, and then after 3 or 4 days to flush the uterus before the fertilized ova has a chance to implant into the walls of the uterus. Okay, and that's great because the cow feels no pain. It's a recyclable system. Basically, every month you can produce more stem cells, and that's the way industry would like to do it. There's only one problem. According to a significant few poskim, that egg, when it's taken out of the cow, has a status of Eiver min achai, of a piece of meat, or basar min achai, taken out of a living animal. Hence, it's not only not kosher for Jews, you're not even allowed to sell it to a goy without violating the prohibition of lifnei iver, of leading him down the garden path where he really shouldn't be going. Okay? what I find fascinating about this, and this one I like in particular, because it's an example of a technology where the halacha people, if they're plugged in really tight, if they're working really well, can now determine the course of cultured meat production. Because these companies want to be kosher. They want to be halal. They want to make money. Well, if we can guide them as to which of the various approaches towards stem cell harvesting are the ones that are halachically more acceptable, and our Kollel, in fact, has already approached a couple of halal experts, because, face it, guys, we're like this little big, you know, a quarter of the world is living in Muslim-dominated countries. So that's where the market is. And these companies all want to sell their product. The opportunity for the ish halacha to lead the way in determining what will be the best practices for that industry, to me, is a very, very exciting opportunity. I'm not trying to slap a Band-Aid around something that's already there and is problematic. I'm trying to actually use the ish halacha's familiarity with the technology as a way of guiding the technology, of influencing the technology, and I believe that we're there. So, in closing, there are many, many more topics that we could talk about, but we'll leave it at that. Let me simply say that, again, to me as a scientist who has had the good fortune, I grew up in Miami, Rabbi Alexander Gross, who was the menahel of the day school in Miami, encouraged us. He says, each of you do what you think you do best. And if Chaim Sukenik was in 5th grade and Chaim Sukenik really loved science, Rabbi Gross didn't have a problem letting him sit and listen in on a 7th grade science class. But he also didn't have a problem letting him sit and listen in on a 9th grade Gemara shir. In other words, the striving for excellence, the ability that if you're going to do something, you do it right, you do it well. That, I think, has to be the theme. And I think science offers a huge opportunity here. And whether it's for understanding things better, whether it's for understanding God's world better, it opens up opportunities that I encourage each person to pursue as he sees fit. Just as we're all not cut out to be philosophers, and we're all not cut out necessarily to be poskim, we're not all cut out to be people of science. But those who have that capacity can use it for their avodas Hashem, can use it in a way where it will sharpen, intensify, and enhance their connection to Torah and their connection to the Ribono Shel Olam. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I don't want to keep people away from dinner. Yeah?
What would you say to someone who wants to pursue the sciences, but unfortunately it's a lot tough today in many universities because there's a lot of other things that they have to deal with that as a Jew they might not.
So go to a frum place. That's one of the reasons that Machon Lev exists. Machon Lev was invented so that B'nai Torah could come and become leaders in science, in technology, in the Air Force, in the industry, in academia, and still be in an environment that's completely gender separated with Mahadran food. In other words, there's no stira, there's no contradiction. Sadly enough, in Israel, there is a perception that, I got to really stay away from academia, because academia is this red flag going back to the Enlightenment. So that battle is a battle that's, I think, way behind us. Today, academia is, in its essence, is largely a trade school. It's a way of developing your skills, of developing your ability to support yourself and to support your family. To do that, while not sacrificing even a little bit of a Torah true environment, you're right, cannot be done everywhere. There are places where it will be harder, and you have to make some decisions. And sometimes you may have to sacrifice a little edge off. I mean, for me personally, again, I can only speak from my own experience. I went to YU, even though it was not the best academic institution that I could have gone to, but it was probably clearer to my parents than it was to me, to be perfectly honest. That was the place where I could grow as a person, because I was spending every morning from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon learning Torah. And then I would still do chemistry well enough that I could get into Caltech to go to graduate school and do a PhD. But everybody has to make that decision for themselves. Guys who come to Machon Lev to get an engineering degree, they're going to come out and have to mix it up when they apply for jobs at Israel Aircraft and at Intel and at Motorola, and they're going to have to go head to head with the guys coming out of the Technion. But that puts the burden on me. That means I have to make sure that the quality of the training they get is good enough, so that the fact that they put their faith in me and came to study in a Torah environment makes sense. Okay, but I agree with you. There are certainly challenges out there, and you gotta man up. You gotta, face them. Yeah.
just when you mentioned the thing about testing different eggs for Tay-Sachs and different diseases and things like that, and perhaps becoming a mainstream thing. I was wondering if there's ever like if you ever fear there's a possibility of science creating so much certainty and predictability and just like health-wise and everything that it may lead to a place where people sort of lose emunah, tefillah, and like that.
So I got to tell you a great story. There's a fellow named Shlomo Havlin who's a physicist at Bar Ilan, also like superstar physicist, and one of his areas of expertise is chaos theory. Okay. 20 years ago, he wrote an article where he poses the following question. He says, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, his tefillah, his holiest of holy tefillah, includes a prayer for rain. Rain in the right amount so that these people won't drown and these people will have a plentiful harvest. What's going to happen? Weather reports today are undeniably better than weather reports were 20 years ago. Okay, the ability to make direct observations from satellites, the ability to do modeling, computer modeling. Any of you like me from South Florida who gets all into these different computer models about pathways of hurricanes, and we sit and watch it until none of the lines make any sense. But weather prediction today is a different world than it was even 10 years ago. Okay, so Havlin asked the question. He says, what if today we can predict with pretty good reliability 3 or 4 days down the line. As computers get faster and more sophisticated and the algorithms for mining very, very large data sets get better, will we get to a point where the weather for the entire next year will be known and the Kohen Gadol's tefillah will be a tefillah shav? How can he be mispalel for rain if the models that we know to be accurate say that it's not going to happen? Okay? So fortunately in that case, chaos theory came to the rescue. And you're able to prove that that cannot be. No matter how good the computers get, no matter how fast they get, no matter how good your data mining gets, you will never get to the point where you will have certainty about the weather in any one place going out a year. And that can be proven. Okay? Now, in terms of other things, is it necessary to put your faith in the science? No. The science is a tool. It's a tool with which to understand God's world. Right? I mean, there's a lot more to talk about there, but I don't see a problem developing. I think we need to have our moral compass in line. We need to understand what the real priorities are, and we need to understand that as human beings, just because we can do something, it doesn't mean we should do something. I agree. There have to be those sorts of constraints, but I don't really see it as a long-term, unsolvable kind of problem. Okay, yes?
This is more of a physics question, and I don't really have a background in science, so I don't know whether it's even a relevant question, but I heard an idea that when we look at matter, we're not really looking at the atom itself, but the rotation of the electron around the atom, and I heard an idea that that's perhaps linked to God's constant creation of the universe. So I wanted to ask if you...
Shivim panim la Torah. I have no problem with it. The fact that this seemingly solid table is mostly emptiness, and that the matter that's in there, the protons and the neutrons and the electrons, comprise a very, very small fraction of the space occupied by the atom, that seems to be true. Okay? Does it have symbolic representation that then leads me to an understanding of Bora, of a renewed Bria? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not much. There's a whole genre of the more mystical side. There's a really nice write-up of how the reconciliation of the plus minus 15 billion year age of the Earth, or age of the universe, actually, can be reconciled and was already found. There are hints to it. The claim is that are found in Divrei Chazal, mostly midrashic. But again, mainstream people like the Ramban were not thrown by that at all. So what level of representation, of simulation, of symbolism speaks to each and every one of us is going to be different. And if that speaks to you, that's great. I'd want to understand a little bit more about it before signing off one way or another. But yeah, that is my argument about the need to process your Torah through where you're coming from. And if you have a background that leads you to certain things, don't shy away from it. Don't deny it. Use it. Make it a tool for a better understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world. Yeah.
When you get to ideas such as like the nuclear force, would you say that, would you give up and say, oh, that's what we don't understand, and then we could say it's God, or do you say that we just don't have an explanation for it yet?
It's a good question. I mean, people have often pointed out that the atheist scientist who buys into a Big Bang as a starting point for the universe may not be terribly far apart in terms of the evolution of the universe from the believer who says that that initial burst was God, or that initial burst was something that the atheist scientist can't define any better, but says, I don't know and I'm not willing to commit. I don't know. There does come a point where I personally am much more comfortable with an intelligent, designed creation as opposed to a completely random set of events. There was a guy, when I did a sabbatical in Rehovot at Weitzman when we were still in Cleveland, a fellow by the name of Lee Spetner, who was a statistician who had been at Johns Hopkins, and he had tried to do some calculations about the probability of productive mutations and things like that, and he was quite comfortable saying there's no way that it could be just, random mutations. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, remember, we found a lot of tools today where you talk about post-translational modification of genetic material, where it's not just the DNA, but it's stuff that happens afterwards, both in the DNA RNA cycle as well as in the proteins that are made. So these things are coming out. I like it when I see it and I get a kick out of it. It is not the basis of my emunah. It does lead to some gee whiz moments, like, isn't that amazing? But you know what? If you're a historian, you can get the same gee whiz moments. All right? I was looking last night. There's a series that someone told me about of events in the early days of World War II. Okay? And he said, this particular episode is one that you should watch. And I'm listening to the narrator, and the narrator says, and it was extraordinary that it happened to be a cloudy day, and therefore the Luftwaffe could not bomb the boats that were coming to pick the troops up at Dunkirk. Okay, yeah. I mean, there are lots of tools that are out there for manipulating the system, and this is sort of a much longer discussion in terms of free will and things like that. But I'm really comfortable with all of that, and I think largely because of my scientific background, not in spite of it.
Just to follow up, would you say, like the nuclear force and dark matter and all that?
Mm-hmm.
Are you more comfortable leaning with the opinion of saying God, or saying we have this scientific? Obviously, God is in the picture, but there's a scientific explanation we just haven't figured out yet. Meaning, are you more? But
that scientific explanation may be the tool that God is using. I don't understand the either or. Your question says it's got to be either this or that.
No, not necessarily either or, but I'm saying there hasn't been a decent explanation for years and years about the nuclear. Like we almost know nothing about it, the nuclear force or any of that stuff. So let's say we never come up with a situation. I understand that we can use science to explain how God works, and God's working within the realm of science per se. Like the explanation of how God created the world, it could be explained through the Big Bang and evolution and all that. I'm saying, but since we haven't found an explanation yet, are you comfortable with just saying that's just how it is?
I'm very comfortable saying there are things I don't know. There are things I don't understand. It doesn't bother me even that much, because that's the way the world is. And one of the neat things about learning new stuff is that when you learn the new stuff, you now understand things that you didn't understand 10 minutes ago. So for me, that's the pleasure of the whole game.
It seems to me, and I could be wrong in saying this, that there's very often a clash between environmentalism and the Orthodox community. It seems to me that the response is generally, as long as you're learning Torah, you're bringing bracha into the world, and if Hashem wanted the world to go wrong, it will go wrong. Would you say, as a religious scientist, would you say, is there a Torah argument that you have a responsibility to that focus?
Absolutely. L'avdo l'shamra. Look at the pasuk in Bereshis, where Adam is placed in Gan Eden, and he is told he is put there to work the land and to preserve it. What does that mean? Who's he preserving it for? He's making sure the system is stable and is functional. I don't have a problem with it, and if anything, there are people who take environmentalism, tikkun olam, and turn it into the sole essence of Judaism. It's not. Is it part of God's mandate to us? Yeah, I believe it is, but it's a piece. There are other pieces that are more spiritual. There are other pieces that are more ben adam l'chavero. We have a variety of responsibilities, right? You're responsible. I'm responsible as a parent. I'm responsible to my spouse. And you do the best you can to keep all the balls in the air. But it doesn't negate. And I think that's really important, yeah.
So early on in the talk, you talked about the possibility of Birkat Torah in a physics textbook, which obviously is a little bit extreme. But depending on who you are. But when we bring up that topic, I guess there's obviously supposed to be some difference between how you approach learning science and about the world from that perspective versus Limud Torah. So how do you juxtapose the ways in which you're going to approach that?
Limud Torah requires, I think, an intellectual honesty that is tempered by a respect for tradition. In other words, there is an acknowledgement that there was a revelation at Sinai. I know that I'm still connected to that revelation. Do I know that I understand 100% of what was revealed then? I know that my Rebbe understood it better than I do, and therefore I have a certain level of respect and almost awe for that Rebbe and for his Rebbe. Science in general makes progress, at least it used to, and still does to some extent, by uprooting that which came earlier. So the systems are a little bit different, but the demand for intellectual honesty and for trying to be objective, I believe is absolutely the same. I don't think there's any difference at all. Yeah?
What do you think about the work of Dr. Gerald Schroeder, and in particular, his view of harmonizing Hashem's creation of the world with, I guess he has a very an unusual timetable.
Right. He's kind of grabbing onto the question of timescales and whether timescales are variable depending not only, as Einstein said, but on distance, on speed. I don't know enough of the fundamental physics to really comment one way or another. I'm not uncomfortable by it, but I would likely feel, even if I understood it completely, that it's not the only approach. In other words, I come back to what I said before. I'm a big fan of this Shivim Panim LaTorah approach. There are a lot. Now, again, within each of the approaches that I would want to declare as valid, there has to be internal consistency, there has to be intellectual honesty, there has to be thorough investigation. Those are requirements for Schroeder's approach and for any other 10 approaches. But at the end of the day, I don't know that even Schroeder himself would say, this is the only way to understand how God created the world. He'd say, this is an approach that is consistent with these medrashim and with these texts and with these pieces of what we know in science. So I don't see it as, again, it's not an either or. Okay? All right, last question.
How do you reconcile explicit contradictory statements within the Gemara, such as statements in regards to trephos and multiple Rishonim's opinions in regards to trephos, as well as concepts such as bats laying eggs, in which we know today is not a thing,
right?
As well as spontaneous gender.
Right. So there are two broad, and I'm sure you know this, but I'll just try to crystallize it into two paths. There are two schools of thought, as far as I know. There may be more. One school of thought says nishtanu atvaim. Nature is different. And whether nature is different is going back 500 years or 1,000 years or to the days of the flood. It's possible. I mean, there are conditions. Even the Big Bang guys say that there were certain conditions of density and speed that have never been reproduced and could never be reproduced, which is why at every chemistry conference that I've ever gone to, there have been sessions on primordial chemistry, and I've never gone to one of them. because it's an irreproducible experiment. But by definition, that's not the domain of science as I understand it. So is it possible that things are different in terms of the functioning of the laws of nature? But I think that's a stretch. I think that by and large, when people have looked to understand how God has managed the world, how the world is managed through the laws of nature as we know them today, it seems to work pretty well. Coming back to yours, so why did Chazal say X if X is seemingly not right? Again, the other school of thought says, you know what? They were expected to function within the best available science of their day. And I can show you sources in Rishonim that make it very clear that if there is something that doesn't line up properly with confirmed science today, that's okay. The confirmed science today is the science. That doesn't change the halacha, that doesn't change the Masorah. Now, it may have halachic implications in terms of what would be the consequence of that science, and that's to be weighed with a posek. But again, for me, it's really, that approach is the one that I connect with very well. And again, you see it in Rishonim on Chumash, you see it in Gemara, that at the end of the day, you can't, ein la dayan ela ma she'einav ro'os. A dayan only sees what's in front of his eyes. I can't hold them accountable for science that was not known in their era. And then I have to come to grips with, okay, now what do I do with the underlying principles of what they said, and how do I apply it within the context of a science that is more adkani, that is more rooted in the reality as we know it today. Okay, but you need to really do that together with a person who's steeped in Torah. That's not an off-the-cuff kind of, well, I'll decide what works and what doesn't work, and I'll decide how to adapt it. Okay, the question of what is a good analogy, what isn't a good analogy, those are things that take a lifetime of experience to really know how to handle that properly. Okay, guys, it's been a pleasure.